Good morning, good afternoon once again, and good evening. Thank you for joining in this third of the series on context and challenges for gender transformative work with men and boys. So this is the third discussion, sorry, that's the wrong mistake in the slide, where we will look into the economic context where the work with engaging boys and men is located, and looking into some of the interconnections between neoliberalism, climate crisis, and care economies. So we'd like to welcome in your own language. So at the same time, what we'd encourage each one of you to also introduce yourself in the chat box. So you can introduce by, adding your name, where you are from, or the country that you are located in right now, and you may add your pronouns that you prefer, and start introducing with each other in the chat box as well. And again, just to repeat, for those who have just joined in few minutes, we have simultaneous interpretations happening as well in Spanish and French. So for that, in order to select your language of preference, you see a small globe button on the bottom of the screen in the Zoom screen. From there, you can select your language. So you need to select that in order to continue hearing in the same language throughout the session. In addition to that, we also have some automated computer-generated translations happening. For that, on the top of your screen, you will see this live on custom live streaming services button. And if you click there, it will pop up a drop-down menu, and there view stream on custom live streaming service. Then it will take you to Wordly, and Wordly generates automatically, in different languages, and you can sort of arrange your screen like this so that you can see the videos on the screen, and then also you can have your Wordly on here, and you can select the language by clicking on the red button there. And these are the languages that Wordly currently does the automatic interpretation. Though just a one, since it's an automated translation, it is not very accurate. So it may give you some sense of what's discussed, but some technical terms or technical issues being discussed, there could be some challenges with regards to the translation. We also have live stream on different channels, so you can follow us on social media with the hashtag Ubuntu Symposium or Symposio Ubuntu in Spanish. And also we have Facebook Live happening as well. So please feel free to follow us on the Facebook page of MenEngage, where we have the live streaming of this session. So before we begin, my name is Laxman Belvase, and I work with MenEngage Global Alliance as one of the co-directors. And on our behalf, again, a warm welcome to everyone today. So we'll start with this video for now.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of Climate Justice Now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet. Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done, rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past, and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 50.
Great. So that's the whole thing that we will be discussing today on unpacking what that means for those who are doing the work with engaging boys and men, or working with men and boys on transforming masculinities. So we will be looking into this urgency that we have in front of us in a bit more, do an analysis, and also look into what can we do practically moving forward. It's just not that we watch these videos and then remain in our homes, but that really asks us to do something so that we can make the change possible. So in that context, some of this might be repetitive to some of those who have been joining us since the last two series, or third one this today, that we developed this discussion paper with Alan as the lead author to sort of contextualize the work that we have been doing with regards to the work with boys and men and transforming patriarchal masculinities. And as MenEngage, the value addition we bring to this conversation is how do we really bring men and boys and transform masculinities in order to address the issues that we have been facing for decades, and still we need to continue. The MenEngage, we launched this paper to make a important case on where the work with boys and men on transforming masculinities must take a political root and contribute towards systems transformation. And what we also intend to do with this paper is also to spark critical conversations among each one of us with looking into the political, economic, and socio-cultural forces that we are facing today. One disclaimer, though, is we don't claim to have answers to all the questions. We have raised a number of questions that we may have to grapple with and find solutions together. And that is why, as MenEngage Alliance and partners and friends, we come together to grapple with what does all of these contexts mean for the work that we are investing in our time, effort, and resources, so that it makes a meaningful intervention in the change we are anticipating to achieve, which is women's rights, gender justice, social justice, climate justice for all. And this is the link where you can find the paper. It's tinyurl.com/MenEngage paper. And as I said, we have already done two of this series. So one, in the beginning, we looking at the systems change as gender justice agenda. Then this last one we did was on political context on the 2nd of February. This one on economic context is what we are doing today, looking into neoliberalism, climate crisis, and care economies. Um, so for that, the format that we have is more of a discussion and conversation, and we also encourage all of you who are participating also to join us from the beginning. And what we intend to do with this conversation is that the conversation becomes very political and based on the current situation that we are facing, an honest conversation, very insightful and relevant to the different contexts that we are located in. But also some many a times, most of us who are in NGO sector or development sector tend to use language that is very only accessible to people in our own bubble. We need to break that so that we can reach publicly to a lot of people. And we urge all of you to use very accessible language so that people who are not necessarily in this field already will be able to understand what urgency we are calling for, what is the need to everyone to be involved in addressing the crisis that we are facing right now, and relevant to the frameworks of the symposium around feminism, intersectionality, sort of gender transformation, accountability, and power with, so that we engage in a meaningful conversation on of these topics. And to do that, we have a fantastic panel, group of speakers, experts, lined with us today. And I'll take a moment to sort of do a quick introduction. And we have Khushi Kabir from Bangladesh. In 1972, immediately after the liberation of Bangladesh, Khushi joined one of the first Bangladeshi NGOs and became the first women to be based in the field to live and work with rural marginalized women and men in some of the most remote areas of Bangladesh. In 1980, she joined Nizera Kori as coordinator on national level NGO working with 237,787 rural women and men in 1,366 villages in the area where she is located. Nizera Kori believes in strengthening strong autonomous organizations of rural people, rural poor, to assert their rights and ensure their entitlement as citizens. It believes patriarchy and class divisions are the twin forces against ensuing equality of women. Khushi is passionately involved in promoting gender equality, rights of women, indigenous people, and other marginalized communities, land and water rights, secularism, environmental justice, food sovereignty, ensuring democratic values and accountability at all levels. Also, we have Andrea Cornwall. She was slightly late in joining, not sure she is here. So Andrea is Pro-Director Research and Enterprise at SOAS at University of London and Professor of Global Development and Anthropology. She is a political anthropologist who specializes in the study of democratic innovation, citizen engagement, participatory research, gender justice and sexual rights, masculinities, women's empowerment, and women's rights and sexualities. We have Martina Comparelli as well from Italy joining us today from Fridays for Future. Martina is a passionate activist helping through social media, graphics, writing, and public speaking. Martina Comparelli is spokesperson for Fridays for Future Milan, and she is a graduate in international development and a student of climate change and health. She is an excellent negotiator, which we'll hear from her. Resourceful motivator, team working lover. Through her academic and consultancy experiences, she has mastered the ability to research, write, advocate, and produce meaningful content on the topic that she is involved in. And we have Vidar. So from Man, Sweden. Vidar is certified psychologist, international project manager, and expert in masculinities and climate change at MAN in Sweden, which is meant for Gender Equality Sweden. He has been active in feminist organization MAN since its inception in 1993, working with engaging boys and men for gender equality and ending men's violence. For Vidar, as for MAN, holding men accountable through close cooperation in women's movement is central to the holistic work with primary violence prevention and the support to women survivors and the work with perpetrators. Vidar also, grew up on a biodynamic farm, and he's passionate about interlinkages between gender equality, the environment, climate crisis, and how to engage more men to care together with others. And we also have Alan, who is the lead author of this paper. Alan is a gender specialist with over 20 years of experience working on issues of masculinities, violence, and oppression in countries of Global South and North. Alan has published widely on these issues, authoring a range of curricula and toolkits for use in professional development. He is an experienced gender trainer and facilitator for strategic planning and project design processes for a range of international and national organizations. As a co-founder of the New York-based Challenging Male Supremacy Project, he is committed to a vision of social justice with gender equality at its heart. Today, he is here with us as the lead author of the discussion paper, Context and Challenges for Gender Transformative Work with Men and Boys. So really, really looking forward to having this conversation. And before I hand it over to Alan for a brief overview, I just wanted to give you a little context on what exactly we will be delving today from the discussion paper. So for several decades now, women's economic empowerment has been a centerpiece for gender and development policy and programming. Although progresses have been made, it has been accompanied by soaring inequalities. These soaring inequalities and uneven gains produced by neoliberal capitalism has long been the target of feminist critique and struggle. The current neoliberal economic system is not only wrecking lives and destroying the basis for life for future generations. Climate change is one of the most urgent global challenge facing the world today. Of course, the concern to MenEngage Alliance, our partners and allies, and our commitment to transform patriarchal masculinities is the long-standing ecofeminist analysis of climate change as rooted in histories of colonial resource extraction and capitalist industrial production, which themselves are shaped and legitimized by patriarchal logic of domination and exploitation. With the discussion paper on men, masculinities, and climate justice that MenEngage produced in 2016, we have tried to argue the importance of making this connection clear in the work we do. The masculinization of industrial production and economies means the green transition must involve transformation in gender narratives about the future of work. Such a transition must also contend with the male-dominated corporate and state elites who benefit from the current neoliberal economic order and violence they unleash to protect their vested interest. So with that as a background, I'll hand it over to Alan for taking us from here. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Lakshman. Hi, everyone. It's great that so many of you can join us. As Lakshman said, I'm going to just give some brief overview of what's in this chapter of the report, of the discussion paper on economic contexts. Next slide, please. And apologies to those of you who've been with us before. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the discussion paper itself. It's based on a context analysis that I drafted as part of the strategic planning process for the MenEngage Alliance. And the analysis itself was based on a literature review that I did, key informant interviews, and the collective discussions of the MenEngage Alliance Global Secretariat and Global Board. And I think that a key point to make is that the analysis presented in the discussion paper it's supposed to be useful. It's supposed to, be informative for action to take. So it's not intended to be an academic survey of all the data and all the research. It's trying to draw out some key points and insights that can be a guide to more effective action by MenEngage Alliance and its members. Next slide, please. And there are kind of three starting points for that move from analysis into action. As Greta Thunberg said in the video, we need radical systems change. And in some ways, we need political leaders to get out of the way, because it's coming anyway, and we need it to be shaped by the forces that we're going to talk about today in terms of the social justice movements that can make this happen. In order to get that change, we need to understand and name what the forces and obstacles are that are in our way, and be very clear about what we're up against. And as Lakshman said, thinking more like beyond the big words, neoliberalism is obviously a big word. What does it mean? What are the forces involved in that, and what would be involved in contesting or challenging those forces? And then I think the question for us as people involved in this work with the MenEngage Alliance is, how does our work, and I'm saying our broadly, you don't have to be a MenEngage member, but if you're involved in this work with men on patriarchal masculinities, how does our work relate to and contribute to movements and agendas for this radical systems change? Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, this is from a convening that took place in late 2019 in Mexico City by feminist activists preparing for the Generation Equality Forum. We seek a radical transformation of a world in crisis, putting women, people, and the planet over profit. And I think, the indications of crisis were very clear in 2019. In early 2021, they're even clearer, I think, given what we've been through in the last year. So really needing to recognize that we're facing very serious problems, and what can we do about them in response? And these are some quotes from the Women's Rights Caucus, which convenes feminist civil society organizations at the United Nations. And the quotes really speak to the ways in which these forces that we're up against are interlinked with each other. So they talk about the neoliberal economic order as a key structural barrier that's exacerbated inequalities. That's linked to and associated with the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, nationalism, xenophobia, supremacist ideologies, and fundamentalism, and being very clear that we need to reject the actions of regressive groups who reinforce patriarchy, nationalism, fundamentalism, authoritarianism, and capitalism. And I think one of our challenges is to think these things together. So the discussion paper breaks it up into separate chapters: economic, political. We talked about political 2 weeks ago. Social, digital, etc. But in breaking them, in disaggregating them, we also need to bring them together as well and see the ways in which they interrelate. Next slide, please. So the paper looks at three key aspects of the economic context that we're confronted with: the links between gender injustice and economic injustice, the climate crises that Greta Thunberg talked about, and care economies. Next slide, please. And breaking down gender injustice and economic injustice, clearly we know, several of our discussants have spent much of their careers addressing these links between poverty, economic marginalization, and gender inequalities. So poverty and economic marginalization are deeply gendered. We know that. There's a lot of data looking at the ways in which women denied access to equal pay, control over economic resources, face a number of obstacles in the workplace, etc. There's a whole raft of data to support that. And certainly since the Beijing conference 25 years ago, there's been a big push for women's economic empowerment as a significant aspect of the international development agenda. But as Lakshman said, that's gone hand in hand with, over the last 25 years, any progress made in women's economic empowerment has gone hand in hand with soaring economic inequalities between countries, within countries, and not only between genders. So we need to make sense of this combination of developments, progress in some places on women's economic empowerment, at the same time as soaring economic inequalities. And I think in terms of in the spirit of kind of trying to better understand what we're up against, I think it's important to talk about the ways in which neoliberalism operates. Sometimes, certainly, when I was kind of growing up and finding out about neoliberalism, the narrative that I was familiar with was that it was about privatization and deregulation, so the kind of absence of the state. And I think there's recent work's been done really making clear that in a sense that's a misperception of what's going on, and that it's not the absence of the state, because the state is central to the organization of the neoliberal economy. If through law and regulation, what the state does, and particularly, the rich states of the G7, etc., they encase the capitalist economy and protect it from democratic oversight. So if you look at the work of neoliberal theorists from the 1920s onwards, Hayek, von Mises, etc., they were responding to two major developments: the expansion of the suffrage and the breakup of the empires in the wake of the First World War and the rise of decolonial movements. So these democratic pressures were seen as a threat to the operation of the capitalist system, which needed to be protected from those democratic pressures. So that's what the encasement is referring to. So it's not the absence of the state that's the problem, it's the absence of democracy that's the problem, democratic oversight over the economy. And I think this lack of democratic oversight is linked to this intense stratification that we're seeing with these soaring economic inequalities. Clearly, class stratification is inbuilt into capitalism, between the owners of capital and the rest of us who sell our labor to capital. So that's inbuilt. Engels in the mid-19th century was talking about gender stratification as being central to the capitalist production, that women's domestic labor helped reproduce the male industrial workforce. But I think we also need to see this stratification operating on a global scale. It's a global system that produces intense stratifications between and within countries. Next slide, please. And this is a great quote from Raymond Connell that describes that stratification. So the international economy has less need of the plantation workforces of the past. So, Western capitalism was built on enslavement and settler colonialism and the resource extraction that went with that. But she's saying, plantation workforces of the past are no longer needed as centrally as they were, but gendered exploitation flourishes in the factories of the South China Miracle, the maquilas of the Mexican borderlands, the expatriate workforce of the oil industry in the Persian Gulf, or among the migrant domestic workers of neoliberal China. Transnational corporations operate through relations between a masculinized managerial elite and gender-divided local workforces. So the gender dimensions of this global stratification are there to be understood and addressed. There's a masculinized elite at the top, and then the working classes, broadly understood, have complex gender relations with this global capitalist system. And I think unpicking those intersections between gender and class are really important in our work moving forwards. Next slide, please. So this language of individualized empowerment, which has characterized kind of neoliberal women's economic empowerment, is inadequate, completely inadequate to the challenges that we face in terms of the work that's needed. And I think some of the work that with men that's been done under the frame of women's empowerment, often in terms of men being better allies to women in their women's empowerment projects, again, is similarly, it's similarly inadequate to the scale and complexity of the challenges that we face. It's important work, but we need to think beyond those models and approaches of individual empowerment. And in terms of the big picture, what we face is a problem, massive problem in the global economy since the late 70s onwards, of overcapacity and underemployment. And there's a lot of work being done now looking at the crisis of jobs, which is already upon us in different ways, in different places, and that will only deepen with the problems of overcapacity and increasing automation. So there's talk of jobless growth. I think that's probably exaggerated to some extent, but there is a massive problem in terms of lack of sufficient employment for sufficient numbers of people. Hence the talk in many circles now of the need for a universal basic income, but often coming from leading capitalists themselves, because they're worried about they're going to run out of consumers. Yeah? There aren't going to be enough consumers for their products. So we're going to need to pay people a bare minimum just to keep them alive and consuming at a bare level. But I think the links between masculinity and work that operate in so many societies, there's a clear gender dimension to this problem of underemployment that we need to think about. It also affects how we think about building collective power. So if the problem with neoliberalism is fundamentally a lack of democratic control and oversight, then the response to that in terms of building collective power to assert that democratic control is the challenge. Clearly, neoliberalism has been accompanied by a massive attack on organized labor in many settings. Underemployment, the informalization of the economy also weakens the collective organizing of working classes. I think what's interesting now is the ways in which that collective power is being expressed less through those formal organizations and more informally. So you see the farmers' protests in India have brought together a range of social forces based in the agricultural economy, from quite poor farmers to quite rich farmers. So there's an interesting kind of class combination there that's operating. Or we have protests over fuel or transport in breaking out in different parts of the world. So the assertion of collective power in the face of neoliberalism is taking different forms. And I think one thing for us to think about in terms of the work we do is the way in which these economic crises become experienced as crises of masculinity. Clearly, changes in the political economy of gender, if you like, the increasing numbers of women entering into waged work, however low paid and precarious, it is changing gender relations in many societies. But I think the problem comes when the crisis is framed as a crisis of masculinity rather than a crisis of neoliberalism, or a crisis produced by neoliberalism. And you can see certain regressive forces, reactionary forces behind a lot of the authoritarian rise in recent years, the ethno-nationalist forces of the far right. They often latch on to this crisis of masculinity as a way to mobilize particularly men, the angry white men of Michael Kimmel's book, in support of their regressive politics, in effect distracting or deflecting attention from the sources of the economic crisis in neoliberalism itself. So in building movements, contributing to movements to contest that, we need to clearly pay attention to the gender dimensions of the economic situation, the gender differences and gender hierarchies. But I think we also need to think about ways of building class solidarities to contest and challenge that neoliberal problems. Next slide, please. And the problems that are being created by neoliberalism are clearly bound up with the climate crises that Greta Thunberg talked about in her video. So we've already mentioned the fact that these are rooted in colonial and settler colonial histories. They're linked to neoliberal economic models and extractivist industries, and they're informed by patriarchal logic of domination and exploitation. And I think what all that means is that when we think about, there's talk about the green transition, how would we transition away from carbon economy to green economies that will help protect the planet. That green transition threatens male elites, masculinized extractivism, and men's jobs. And those threats are very direct, right? As Greta said, we are coming for you. And she's talking to elites there, largely dominated by men, right? So there are male elites whose interests are directly threatened by economic policies under the green transition. It also threatens the extractivist economy, which, as I said, is based on this kind of masculinized logic of domination and exploitation. And many men work for these industries. These industries that we're trying to change are male-dominated industries. The mining industries, oil industries, they're male-dominated industries. So there's a very kind of practical issue about the transition is a transition for the men in those industries, and how do we support or help that happen? What's our role in that? The nature of that, the threat, is very clear from the violence that people who are trying to push the green transition face when they try and push it. So the violence that indigenous communities face when they're trying to protect their lands from mining and other corporate extractivist industries. It's often women in those indigenous communities who face the most violence, or the women human rights defenders who are trying to protect that land from exploitation by extractivist industries. So there's a very clear link between gender-based violence and these climate crises that we're concerned about. And sometimes I think our work on gender-based violence doesn't have a big enough view of the ways in which this violence is bound up with neoliberalism itself and these climate crises. So it's no surprise that the people like Greta, young people, and often women and young women, are in the lead of actions to contest climate crises and push for economic and green justice. And it's often women from the most impacted communities, indigenous communities, marginalized communities, are in the leadership of that. Next slide, please. So you see here women from the Standing Rock Indian Reservation protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016, 2017 in the US. This is the quote that Lakshman read out at the beginning. So it's the needing to remember that the long-standing eco-feminist analysis of climate change is being rooted in these histories of colonialism and capitalist industrial production, shaped by this patriarchal logic, which we've talked about. Next slide, please. And this patriarchal logic is also evident in the split between production and social reproduction. This is a quote from Feminist Manifesto for the 99% by Nancy Fraser, Cynthia Rutzer, and Tithi Bhattacharya. So we all know this, but it's just a reminder that social reproduction is deeply gendered, assigned to, associated with women. Its organization depends on gender roles and entrenches gender oppression. It's a feminist issue, and you can see women there as domestic workers organizing. But it's also shot through by fault lines of class and race, sexuality and nation. So again, it's very critical, I think, that we bring this deeply intersectional understanding of the issues that we're confronting. So next slide, please. So the third and final piece in the paper is care economies, and we need to, the gender inequalities and care economies that we know about in terms of the burden of domestic household work, caring work that falls on women, disproportionately borne by women. We also need to understand that intersectionally as well. So the international care chains of domestic workers moving between countries tends to be from global south to global north, or from poorer areas of countries to urban centers, from working class women and ethnic minority women providing care services to middle-class women and ethnic majority women. So there are a whole set of issues of intersecting forces of oppression that play into that gender inequalities in care economies. For us, it's also important to recognize that the neoliberalized care economy over the last 25 years globally has been bound up with an intensified focus on family values as being the source of and the kind of provider of care and social reproductive labor, which has been accompanied by a retreat of the state in many countries from social provisioning. So we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that the care economy and family values are neoliberal projects. Sometimes we think of family values as being a conservative emphasis, but it's actually deeply bound up with neoliberalism itself. And here it's important to look at the ways in which that neoliberalized care economy has also been accompanied by a discourse around responsible fatherhood. Most of the fatherhood programming that we see around the world got going in the last 25 years. And one can make a link. We could talk about the strength of that link, but I think one can make a link between the ways in which the neoliberal emphasis on family values has relied on this focus on irresponsible fathers, and the solution to the problems of care and social reproduction in society are about making fathers more responsible. Now, that's not, obviously we need to be working with men to share domestic labor and fatherhood parenting equitably with women, but this privatization of responsibility for social reproduction is the problem that we also need to recognize and address. And we see the costs of that retreat from social provisioning throughout last year and into this year in terms of the responses to COVID, right? The country where I grew up, the UK, and the country where I now live, US, the most neoliberalized economies in the world, have had the most appalling responses to the COVID crisis, in large part because of the long histories of austerity policies with regard to state provision of social care and responsibility, and also almost a kind of commitment to the state being absent from the provision of social care, that it's on individuals and families. Remember, Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. It's only individuals and their families. And that kind of family values emphasis has had devastating consequences in terms of the COVID-19 response. So we need I think, rather than care economy, I think we need more of a conversation about life making. That's the term that they use in the notes for a feminist manifesto, and new visions of care relations that support that life making over profit making. Next slide, please. And this notion of care remains deeply gendered. We talked about the social reproduction and that being feminized. More broadly, caring for the planet is often framed as a feminine attitude and rejected by machista, male chauvinist patriarchal value systems that devalue and erase the work of women. So that's a quote from an Oxfam report, Feminist Futures, Caring for People, Caring for Justice and Rights. So we need to break that kind of gender binary that assigns care and life making as a feminized attribute, and profit making and exploitation as a masculinized attribute. Next slide, please. So implications, there's lots of implications. I'm just picking out 3 to think about. I think when we think about the restructuring of the economy that will be required to deal with the crises that we've been discussing, that will involve reconstructing ideas about and practices of masculinity. So we need to kind of think about how we talk to men about this green transition in terms of masculinity and what that means for them. I also think, as well as holding male elites to account in terms of the changes that are needed, as Greta was talking about, we also need to do work within our own movement spaces and the ways in which male supremacist and patriarchal practices show up in our own movement spaces. Because we will be more effective as movements the more that we can be the future that we want to create. So challenging male supremacy within organized labor and economic justice movements, I see as an important aspect of that work. And then more generally, I think as the MenEngage Alliance, we need to be building more explicitly with movements for equitable and sustainable life making and social solidarity, and kind of getting past this language of, it's almost like this neoliberalized language of the care economy and that kind of framing of the problem. We need to really change that up and think about equitable and sustainable life making. Last slide, please. And with all that, maintain a commitment to accountability. This has become a critical emphasis of the MenEngage Alliance itself, and done a lot of work to build practices and understandings of accountability. So as we build with these movements for economic justice, climate justice, with an emphasis on gender justice, we need to be doing that and ensuring that those are being led by those most affected by the injustices, including people with non-normative gender identities and expressions and sexual orientations, and ensure that whatever work we are doing within the Alliance itself is informed by this practice of accountability and the shared analyses of the injustice that we face. All right, thank you. I'll hand it back to Lakshman.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, for quite comprehensive presentation on what we will be delving more into today. And I think absolutely, I don't want to add anything more onto that, and now move on to hearing from our experts who would elude us on more on how do we then make this content, this kind of talk or this kind of analysis, and make it more pragmatic in the what we are doing and how it relates to the specific what we all are doing in our own context. Before I invite Khushi and Andrea for a conversation, I also want to encourage all of you who are listening in to also share your reflections, comments, thoughts, or questions on how are you feeling after this analysis, after hearing this analysis, in terms of you have lived, you have been working in this different context. Well, how does it feel like in the work you are doing, all what Alan just presented relates to? So you can continue adding your reflections in the chat box, and I'd like to sort of invite Khushi and Andrea for a conversation, and we'll leave you with these 4 big questions, and up to you to sort of look at which are relevant to cover. What do you think the problems that we need to be confronting in order to make the work more political? What do we think of the analysis presented, or is anything specific missing that you would like to add on to or elude us to in the chapter? And how useful did you find these issues being raised, and what is your message and ours for MenEngage members and those who are working on engaging boys and men? So with that, Andrea and Khushi, over to you.
Do you want to go first?
Andrea, you go first. Yeah.
You go first, I think. It's good.
Should I go first?
That's okay.
You come second later. Okay. I'd like to thank everybody and for asking me to be part of this. I congratulate Alan, Greg, and his whole team and bringing out this very important. It's a paper that will need a lot of time reading. I read through it, but if you want to go beyond, then maybe we need to think. You have the summary at the beginning, but I think it delves quite deeply. Now, I'll talk about it more from my perspective as an activist who has been, since 72, been an activist and working. So I'm not an academic at all. So I think Andrea and me look at, I've read you and I've known you, but we have a similar position and perspective, but our work are from 2 different perspectives and 2 different ends of the spectrum. So I'll start with the work I do, and I work with mainly rural communities. But because I've been working for so long, a lot of people in the urban communities who feel marginalized, who feel that they have been not been heard, and they feel that there are a lot of problems being that they face, do reach out. But that's to me as an individual. But my work has basically been over 5 decades almost, nearing five decades, with the rural communities. And in the rural communities, when I first went in, it was immediately after the liberation war and the independence of Bangladesh. And it was a war-torn economy with houses and villages being burnt, etc. And those of us going from the cities had I was the only woman who went there. I forced myself to go and work in the villages because people were thinking it was not possible for an urban, city-based young woman, who I was young, single, to be able to work in a very remote areas. I didn't find any problems with people accepting me, but what I just wanted to say that we had an idea about a rural-urban divide. The patriarchy was not something that was very popular or discussed at all. Class was, because this was the 70s, late 60s, 70s, when class was very dominant in discussions amongst a lot of the people, but not patriarchy, not feminisms at all. So when I went and started working in the rural areas, it's not just an urban-rural divide. And within the rural, you have class within the rural, and you have women within the rural communities who, as a whole, there's a gendered division. And in that gender division, you have, again, class hierarchies, occupation. Your occupation determines where your position is in class, in society, and the voice that you may have or not have. So all these are things that I learned firsthand, which now we talk in and call intersectionalities. Now we want to talk about and say a lot of other words. But those are things that I started feeling and understanding and realizing. It was really an education experience to see what was happening at the grassroots, at the actual level of people themselves. Over the years, what I'm seeing now, like since the 70s, and now this is 2021, I see a whole pattern and change. People still think about that the production process in the rural areas of the agrarian economy is very similar, and they're moving in, the state is moving in with the neoliberal economic agenda, which is not controlled by even the big farmers anymore, who are based in the rural areas. It's corporate sector. It's really promoted and protected and projected by the state, where they're going against their own perceptions of equality for all, land for the tillers, landless peasants would get access to government-owned land, which, etc. These lands are now being given away for special economic zones, for creating of military bases, for creating of tourist spots in the most, you have this case that we're all now fighting is in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, really removing villages after villages of one of the most endangered and the most minor groups of indigenous communities from their homes to build a huge a chain with Marriott hotels, etc. And Marriott Hotel tries to say that they are not yet involved and there's only discussion. But their names are up on the billboards. And we've been asking them, how come you're not challenging and taking a case against your name being misused? Because this is with the army and with the government state's patronage. So people are being, totally marginalized. So we see that the classical way we have been thinking of what, a simplistic way of thinking of class, etc., and even gender, etc., we have to now look at what the realities are, who controls whom, and who is making the decisions and how this is happening. And over here, of course, gender injustice is very much a part of, when you talk of economic injustice, gender injustice comes absolutely bang right. It's the women who face it. And the biggest example was with the recent corona, during the lockdown, when people had to leave jobs, people had there was the lockdown, they didn't have any employment. The men were there. It was the amount of violence that increased. And a lot of women that we work with said that in all the years of being in a relationship and being in marriage with this man, they had not been physically assaulted as they had during the COVID-19 situation. That was the first time. And you talk to the men, and the man is, we feel frustrated. Our masculinity is being questioned because I'm not being able to. My role is only to bring in the money or the food so that the family can be fed. She has to feed the family nevertheless, no matter what. And she has to do all the work, and she has to forage and find out how she can manage. And he sits around feeling frustrated and takes it out in violence, which then becomes much larger. And because there is no law and order situation, because there's nobody going out, it goes into society itself. So the question that is being raised, that individual and society, you're not separate, you're part of society. And society consists of individuals, but individuals are, the way they're thinking and their process and how they behave and what they consider as being the norms is dictated to by society, which then is again dictated to by the neoliberal paradigm of through whether it's media, whether it's the social media, whether it's your voices going around, whether it's just the commercial media, etc. All this is happening, and we are talking now of care economics, and I think a lot of NGOs, women's organizations are talking of the care economy. But I think what they're missing out is, what does it really mean? And how will it affect the entire family? And I think I want to thank MenEngage, because it's not just talking about what we've done, and I've seen other NGOs do also. They start ticking boxes is, have the men been involved in domestic chores, helping with cooking, helping with looking after children, helping with washing clothes, helping with cleaning and all that. That's not enough. It's the mindset. And I think that's what we need to do, is very much, I won't go into the details. I've got so many points written up, but I just want to say that we need to start thinking that when we talk about the neoliberal economic agenda, which is really controlling and really determining and deciding for us and all the people who live on this planet, whether the planet will survive or not, whether there will be nature for us to live on, whether nature can nurture us, whether we can nurture nature, what our lives will be and what we think. And I'll just say that it's not just the economics of it, it's the social system, and a lot of it is also in a way, guided by idealism and the ideology in the name of religion, whichever the religion may be. Playing the religious agenda, playing the religious game, just reinforces everything. So I find all of it, at least in my experience, going very much hand in hand. And I leave it here for Andrea to take on, and then we can have a discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kushi. And thank you very much for inviting me, MenEngage, and to Alan for a really stimulating and interesting paper. And I think there's a lot to say, a lot, building on some of the things that Kushi has already talked about. Yes, I am in an academic institution, but we have a lot in common in terms of, seeing some of these injustices in the world and how they could be addressed. And similarly with Alan, these are lots of conversations that we've had and working together also on the work we've done on men in development. So I've been reflecting back on some work I did many, many years ago in a book called Dislocating Masculinity. And I was thinking, well, it's maybe not dislocated. We argued at the time that there are many different masculinities, that some are dominant, and these dominant masculinities end up pushing out and pushing to the margins alternative ways of being a man, and also pushing to the margins women. And these dominant sort of toxic forms of masculinity have become problems for men as well as for women and for people of all genders. And I went back to that thinking it's not about dislocating masculinity, it's about dislocating patriarchy and dismantling the perpetrators of patriarchy. And the perpetrators of patriarchy aren't only male. People can perpetrate patriarchy from many different subject positions, many different gendered positions. And what we've got at the moment is a concentration of particularly toxic forms of patriarchal power rising around the world with populist regimes, with who are completely unaccountable. We see in Britain the rise of certain ways of doing things in the government with impunity, the reinforcement of ideas about very sort of stereotypical notions of gender that are getting more and more deeply embedded. There's an intensification of the very gender norms that feminists of my generation and many feminists have sought to try and address and change, and that I see very much as being aligned with MenEngage's project, is to pluralize the way in which we think about gender rather than to concentrate it into these very narrow extremes. And what we've seen, I think, in recent years, and Alan picks this up very well, I think, in the paper, is, as you say, a crisis of masculinity being produced by the crisis in neoliberalism and the ways in which neoliberalism has worked both to disenfranchise, a lot of men. And so some work I did with Nancy Lindisfarne and Frank Carrioris and others on looking at how masculinities are being produced under neoliberalism, how they're being marginalised under neoliberalism, but also which masculinities end up being fostered and favoured with neoliberal economic arrangements that are also arrangements of governance and these concentrations of toxic patriarchal power in our government institutions, but also in the economy. And so this whole question about, this reconfiguring of masculinities and power in the current conjuncture, now not only the crisis of neoliberalism, but the crisis of care. And I think coming back to some of the other points that come in the paper and also that Kushi has made, something that's become really evident during the COVID pandemic is the reinforcing of traditional gender roles. People were staying at home, and then who goes back to work first? Well, it's the men. The women end up caring for the children. The women ending up doing a lot of the childcare and the child schooling. Men are, according to data from studies, I saw a study from Turkey that UNDP did, men saying they're doing 5 times as much domestic work as they did before under lockdown, but women are still doing 4 times the number of hours of work, of domestic work than men. So this massively unequal domestic work burden is still falling heavily on women, even where we have neoliberal women's empowerment programs where women are being empowered to go into the market in a very individualized way and carrying all the care burden that they originally carried. So there's something there around the configuration of care and neoliberalism, and then also the environment and sustainability in relation to the toxic effects of these ways of working. And so thinking about COVID and thinking about the fault lines in the global policy response for COVID and looking through, the UNDP's got a very interesting gender tracker. And I was doing some work with them recently and looking at how many of the social protection measures, for example, are targeting women's economic security. How many women have any economic security? And also as a corollary, how many men have economic security? And so the large numbers of people who don't have any access to social safety nets. And exactly the situation that Kushi was describing of these kind of situations where people are so disempowered by the economic situation that the forms of violence that emerge then are just exacerbating the kind of inequalities and toxicities that are being produced through those economic arrangements. I think for me, an interesting question is, well, what do you do? What do we do? What do you do about this in terms of MenEngage? What do movements do about this? I think Alan's points are really important about the need for a new way of thinking about the economy. And in a way, COVID provides us with an opportunity as a human community across the world to reset, because things have become so extreme. It's exacerbated the extremities. It's shown that things are unsustainable. It's shown that something needs to be broken, something needs to be actively broken and remade. And I think there's something there in terms of challenging male supremacy in all the spaces that you pointed out, Alan, but also particularly in the spaces of power. This project of dismantling the perpetrators of patriarchy, taking apart the reproduction, the reinforcement in all of those spaces of governance in the economy that we've seen in recent times, whether it's Trump or whether it's through the behaviour of some of these global corporations. So I think there's a very powerful thing that can come out of COVID, awful as COVID has been. And I think also when we look closely at what's happened under COVID and the failure in many cases of governments to deal effectively with the care economy, we need a new way of recentering that economy and thinking about it much more, less as being about, as Ellen said, less about the care economy and more about reframing it. But I think there's something about putting social reproduction into really thinking about a new economy that places social reproduction as everyone's responsibility and that the costs are shared by everybody. So it's actually a different way of thinking about social reproduction and placing the economy at the service of societies and at the environment and human well-being rather than the other way around. And to do this, we need a new economic model. We need universal care systems. We need to count unpaid care. We need to rethink the importance we give for those who care, who've become essential workers in the pandemic. And with that, rethinking the gender dimensions of that. I think we also need to think about state action, where state action can be taken to change the gender-based segregation of labour and extend social protection to all. So actually the state, it's time for them to step up. States are stepping up as agents of change in the COVID pandemic. And I think there is something that can be done there again to reset and to rebuild. Social protection for all that respects human dignity, but also begins to deal differently with some of these questions of gender and the ways in which gender is dealt with in legislation, and also dealing quite differently with the environment. I think there needs to be also real investment in thinking about the gender-digital divide and access to digital, digital means, access to the internet, and the extent to which that is really strengthened during this pandemic. And I think in relation to gender in that regard, part of it is also trying to think differently about the ways in which the engagement of movements like MenEngage and other people who are working on gender are working on looking at the ways in which the communications media and representations of gender appear. So the concentration again of these toxic forms and the need to break with them and to create a plurality of different narratives, stories, representations of people doing things so that young children and people are not just simply being fed a set of representations that don't show anybody challenging those norms. And I think MenEngage have worked really interestingly with this in the past. So disrupting these biases, challenging these negative social norms, and finding a different set of frames. And that, I think, Alan, your really interesting point about needing to look within as well, looking at movement spaces, looking at the spaces in which we are present and we are organising, and looking at how to build these stronger solidarities across them. And again, we're in a pretty, this moment is a very disruptive moment. And I think there's a lot of promise in that. People starting to push back because things are so very, very bad. And maybe that's me being an optimist again. But I think it is because I'm always optimistic that there's a possibility of change. And sometimes when things get really bad, people get conscious and they start to move and they start to organise and they start to bring about change. But that change needs to be something in which men are able to participate in disrupting patriarchal power at all levels, within men's movements, within the spaces in which they're active, but also particularly, and to come back to a point right at the beginning about those spaces of power, where there's such a concentration of toxic masculinity, that I think that's, as part of the MenEngage movement, it'd be really interesting to say, well, in terms of where you're going to take this, where are the training programs that dismantle patriarchal power in these institutions? Where is the work around masculinity going right into the heart of these organisations and starting to deal differently with it? We don't need any more of the old gender training. It wasn't very useful anyway. We need targeted action of this kind that really starts to confront and challenge some of these things and call out and bring some accountability. And I think then there are lots of alliances going to be built in seeking accountability on many fronts. I'll stop there and pass back either back to Kushi or back to Laxman.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I would like to take a pause and invite Martina and Vidar as well for this first round. So hold on to your thoughts and we'll come back again, all 4 of you, with Alan, 5 of you, and we can continue with, again, more thinking. So great points made, and I'd now invite Martina and Vidar for you to take from here on adding from your thoughts, your experiences. And right now we also have another series that's going on, which looks particularly into climate justice, which Vidar is coordinating as well. The next one is on the 25th of February, that where we look into more into climate justice and men and masculinities work. Now over to Martina and Vidar for you to have the conversation on the similar questions. What problem analysis you heard, and what is it from your point of view that is most urgent and important for us to remember and reiterate again and again? Anything missing from what you think needs to be something that MenEngage members or those working with boys and men need to think. So over to you.
Thank you. You go, Martina.
Shall I? Okay.
Yeah.
So after these two speakers, I'm really embarrassed. What to say? First, I want to say that I waited for a moment to talk about patriarchy and the climate crisis for a long time, because this is an aspect that I don't think is explored enough. So the problem is that there are different kinds of hierarchies and dominations in our world, in our society. And as there is one of man over nature, there is one of man over women. But when we think about it, it's all part of the same system. So we distinguish them, but at the same time, they're part of the same thing. So maybe that's the reason why, as it said in the paper, caring for the planet, caring for the earth is kind of a feminine attitude according to common thinking. But of course, it shouldn't be like that, because caring for the planet is more caring about your life, your livelihood, what keeps you going as a species. So there's this disconnection that it's not really understood in common society, and I love that MenEngage is trying to get at that and go from a work on patriarchy on a work to a work about the climate crisis and patriarchy. So what I really liked about the paper is the part discussing migrations, because that's what I studied. And I think that this is explored in a very interesting way. So I'm from Italy, and the fact that most of these gender violations happens on the routes, on the Mediterranean route, and happens in Libya. And my country signed some accords with Libya to keep the migrants there and to send them back there, which is also illegal from an international law perspective, is something that really hurts me a lot. And thinking about how the political arena, as it was said in the previous meeting, is dominated by the male presence, is something that comes back into my mind when I think about all these women being victims of violence on this route and because of these accords. So how does it link to the climate crisis? In a video in which Nuna and Greta already spoke in this symposium, they said that the climate crisis is the overarching crisis, is the crisis that underpins our crisis. And the interesting fact is that, for example, COVID-19 as a zoonosis, as a kind of as a disease that is linked to the way we live with other species, it's so linked to the climate crisis, and we fail to see that because probably we are afraid to face the climate crisis. And that the same way migrations are propelled by climate crisis, and migrations lead to violence. Urbanization sometimes is propelled by the fact that the climate crisis is destroying lots of livelihoods. So people have to, like farmers, have to go into urban centers, live in dirty conditions, and gender violence happens in those conditions. So everything is really connected, and the bad thing is that climate crisis propels these facts, but at the same time, there's the neoliberal system staying behind and propelling the climate crisis. So at the end of the day, it all moves in a circle, and we have to break that wheel. We have to break that chain. And I think that working with masculinities is an important step, and not a lot of people are in the organization are doing this. And I think that, of course, you have to try and take a structural approach, but at the same time, if you change the way an individual behaves in its context, at the end of the day, something about the structure is going to change. Because, you know, we are not islands. We don't live isolated from others. When we change our behavior and our mindset change, at the same time, we are going to affect with social diffusion what happens to the others. But we cannot neglect the fact that the solution to the climate crisis must be political, because it cannot be separated from a vision of social justice and climate justice. Because there is no neoliberal solution to the climate crisis, because neoliberalism is what caused the climate crisis. And if we fail to see that, we will never get out of this crisis alive. And the point is that probably the fact that climate is such a politicized issue is not because, it's not because climate is, of course, it's been politicized and it's political on some extent, but it got to this crisis point because the solutions to the climate crisis scared a part of society, scared the neoliberal system. And for that reason, climate has been politicized, have been enclosed into a space of environmentalism, while climate is an issue that goes beyond environment. It goes beyond economy. It's something overarching, really, as I already said. Well, we live in a system that tries to put it into closed boxes, into a binary system between the environment and us. And this is something that, and I'm closing, I'm ending my intervention, something that also hits us as activists. So, for example, when we try to talk with workers and with unions, which also are quoted in the paper very interestingly, the problem is, okay, we admire what you do because you're young people caring for your future, but we have to care about the present, we have to care about working places, we have to care about employment. And that's a big mistake, because of course, it wouldn't be a neoliberal system, but in a new system, you will have job, you will have livelihoods in accordance with the climate, without actually keep ruining and exploiting nature. They are creating black males and dualism and binary between activists, climate activists, and workers, and they do it with climate activists and farmers, whereas we are on the same side. And this is what we have to try and reach. We have to try and recognize that there are nuanced positions, but at the end of the day, we are all on the same side. The point that somebody made in the chat, that it is the same storm, but the boats are different, is totally true. I was reading in the paper something that left me a bit startled. It was that everyone is damaged by patriarchy, but of course there are people that are victimized, whereas somebody else isn't as much victimized. And I think that the best part of MenEngage is that there is this recognition, there is the attempt of explaining this, of explaining the theory behind this to the men you're working with. And I hope this can go on, and I hope to see more of the climate crisis included in your work. And I also thank you again for inviting us here. I'm sorry for speaking on behalf of maybe so many women that are not in a privileged position as I, as a white woman from the West am. And And yes, I really hope that you all go on, and I would like to know from Vidar what he thinks about it and what he thinks about involving the climate even more in your discussion. And yeah, sorry for my cat. He's young and he likes to be at the center of attention. Toxic masculinity down here.
Thank you very much, Martina. I love that the cat is with us. It's good that we are more than humans in this conversation as well. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this paper and for this invitation to be part of this seminar. I am delighted by the paper. It's like music to me. I think really that we as MenEngage, and I speak as a MenEngage member, and my organization, Men for Gender Equality, is part of MenEngage. We really need to join hands with other movements. We need to do it to be accountable. We also need to do it. We have to do it if we want to reach our goal of a gender equal world, free from violence and for everybody. I share Andreas' optimism. I think the fact that the climate crisis is actually threatening our very existence. And yeah, I need to say that again. It is threatening our very existence. Means that it is also threatening patriarchy and neoliberal capitalism, because it becomes so very obvious and clear that we can't continue in this way. We have to find other ways. And we do have shared enemies, and that can bring us together. That's a common thing. We know a lot about that. But what we really have here is that we are sharing a planet that we need to care for. So we can unite in caring, not against an enemy, but for something. And that is care for each other and care for the planet, because it's very obvious that we have to do that. There is no other way. And thank you, Fridays for Future. You are really leading us in this. And for me, that is, it's a great privilege to be here together with you, Martina. I have had also the privilege to be with Greta every Friday for a long period in Stockholm. And it's that in itself to kind of realize and understand for men that the young girls and the women, you are our leaders here. You're showing the way, and it's up to us to join and to echo what you are doing. We don't need to invent the wheel and do something special here with men. We can just be the echo chambers of your messages and your clarity in this. I also hear what you're saying, Martina, that there is not many organizations who do the work on masculinities and climate crisis. And there, again, it becomes very clear that we as MenEngage need to do this, and we have a responsibility to do this, because there are not so many other actors who have the experience and knowledge in how to engage men as part of the solution in a feminist way for justice and for climate justice. So I think we really have a responsibility here, and we have in different ways been trying. And we were asked to say something about the problems that we need to be confronting. And of course, we have been talking a lot about the external problems, but we do also need to look at our internal problems that we need to confront. Because since 2014, at the previous global symposium in Delhi, we kind of started the discussion on looking at the climate crisis and how we can step in and actually answer the call from Naomi Klein saying this changes everything. We can't leave the environment and the climate crisis to environmental organizations and politicians. We all have to step in with all our different knowledges. And she also said that the beautiful thing with that is that then we together can also create the equal and just and sustainable world that we want much better and much more effective. So we did start that conversation there. And then in 2016, in the beginning of 2016, right after the Paris Agreement, we kind of managed to write this discussion paper on men and climate, men, masculinities, and the climate crisis, and had some ideas there for how to move on in working with this. But it's been really hard and really difficult because we are, first of all, we are so overloaded with everything we are working with already. And we are, in that sense, even though we're doing so important work, which is about stopping men's violence against women, we, in a sense, continue our business as usual as if there was no climate crisis. And one reason and one challenge and one really difficult thing is that we in some way worry about, so how we don't want to spread too thin. So if we start to look at climate crisis, maybe then we lose focus on our main issue, which is men's violence against women. And here again, we have this divide. We create those binaries of either or, and which is pushed on us by patriarchy and by the neoliberal economies, that we think we have to do either or, instead of seeing that this is all connected and we have to step up to this challenges. Another thing is that it very easily feels like it's too big, it's too difficult, we feel powerless. So we better don't go there. We continue with something we can handle. And that's just not good enough. And Fridays for Future definitely are showing us that. And we, as someone said when we were preparing for this event and this session, someone said we have to make what the feminist girls and women's climate justice movements and justice movements are doing. We have to make that our minimum as MenEngage. We can't say we are not doing that because we are working with men's violence against women. The girls and the women can handle all those other things like climate crisis and so on. That's just not enough. Yeah. We have tried to do different things. One of the things we have done is to create this is also connected to what is on individual level and what is on structural level. We use some of our competence in doing men's groups, reflecting on men's violence against women, reflecting on masculinity norms and so on. And we just developed that further by widening it to include also care for the environment and the climate. And then in the end of that 8-session process, really also look at, so, okay, we see how this is all connected and we need to do something. So now what is my next step? What can I do? And in there, not just look at what can I do, but who can I go to who are already working with this and ask them, how can I help you? So in that way, create that movement from the kind of individual community-based behavioral change work into movement building. And some beautiful things come out when we evaluate those groups that, for example, people say, men say, so it's when I feel connected, when I do connect to relationships with humans, with women, with all genders, and with the earth, I kind of dismantle the patriarchal divide and connect. Then it's less interesting and less possible to dominate. You just don't want to anymore. And it's much more interesting and easy to care. And we've done exercises from this material also with some minister in Sweden, and he thinks this is really powerful, and he want to create groups within the parliament, and things like that. It's possible to move from the individual to the structural changes. There's a lot to share. One more thing is just we talk about care and how to engage men for the caring, and I think what we need to talk about is all men care and care for different things. The problem usually is that the care is so limited, it's so narrow, focusing on things that are very close to myself, and we need to look at how to widen that care. And I agree with the work with the trade unions. I think that's a really important thing. And how can we, who know something about how to engage men for change, how can we work with the trade unions to be helpful in the green transition, especially with the men working in the fossil industry? And I used to say before that because these men, they can really go to arms because they are really pushed and used by the neoliberal capitalism and patriarchy. But now after the capital, we know that they do take to arms. It's not something they can do. They are doing it. They have done it already. And we need to work with them. That was long, sorry. I think I stopped there. Sorry. One thing that I am maybe missing in the paper and that we could do more of is to start to also describe what is it that we want to create. What is the post-patriarchal world? What is an ecological, sustainable, gender equal world like? And it's interesting because there are so many stories about that. Then we have to go back to the Stone Age. But in fact, it's a world of abundance where we stop using so many resources in controlling and keeping a patriarchal system in place, and we can start using all those resources in cooperation and creativity and meeting real needs instead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Martin and Vidar. Sorry to interrupt. There is so much to talk about, and we would like to bring all 4 and 5 of you together to continue the conversation. But before that, while my colleagues can spotlight the rest of the speakers as well, there are some interesting comments and reflections coming in the chat box as well, and I think there is an call for sort of do more analysis on the situation we are facing and the urgency of the topics that we are discussing right now, so that we can bring together efforts in solidarity. So I think there is a need for being standing in solidarity with the rest of the movements as well moving forward, rather than taking it as only something that we need to or we ought to look at in isolation. I think there is a bigger strength in connecting hands, standing in solidarity with what we are doing. We don't need to reinvent wheels. Fully agree. We join hands, we speak, and amplify the agenda that we all are working in from the different spaces that we are in. Also, there are some, team from UK, brings in, the issue of male supremacy in organized labor, and his experience in the UK has been really challenging in the sense that, the issues of sexism or looking at gender equality or gender as such as a concept has not even moved into these spaces. How do we move into these spaces so that we can challenge the neoliberal understanding that's there, and that's been still the heavy point. And the issue of patriarchy impacts everyone but differently is already came up. Yorker from UK mentions states are taking an increasingly interventionist role in relation to here on COVID-19, but also in the process becoming more centralized and autocratic in some cases. Political neoliberal ideologies are also mutating or changing into very liberal yet libertarian ideologies. What seems to be shared across those is their fundamentally patriarchal ideologies. So, and then Ross from US again, building on to the comment from Team Shan that COVID has also given some positive experiences. Ross adds to the question that vis-a-vis Yorker's comment on how state has been really sort of doubling down in institutionalized patriarchal responses as well. And Helga brings a point, especially to Khushi, spoke about international cooperation companies taking land from rural communities for profit making. It is continuity of colonial structures and creating dependence. So that's something. And the question there is how about returning to the community ideas of pre-colonial times, men working with women on the land for life making and thus united against international corporate companies. So, and then Sabita brings in an interesting point that the overall concept of development and someone has to sacrifice the greater good has to be challenged in this work. So there are a few more as well, but I'll stop there for now and open up for you five to have a conversation among yourself. Anyone who would like to start?
Well, let me thank everyone for all those comments and discussions and the questions that got raised as well. I love what Khushi said about the need to change mindsets. And what I had the privilege of spending a couple of days with some Nigeri Kori staff and the communities they work with. And what struck me there was, the men's mindsets were changing as a result of being a part of those landless rights struggles. So we can change mindsets partly through being more involved in struggle. And I think then that, to me, that's raises questions about how we kind of, like Vidar said, enter struggles humbly and think about, practices of solidarity. And maybe MenEngage members need to think about getting better at how do we work in solidarity with a whole range of movements. And then just to pick up on what Andrea said about media and narratives around toxic masculinities, I just think that's huge. I mean, what struck me, if you couldn't live through the last year in the US without realizing that people are living in alternate realities, right? And those are shaped by media. People are just exposed to different media, exposed to different information, and that affects the way they relate to the world. 74 million people still voted for the former president, despite all the catastrophes that he's overseen. So thinking about how we engage with, relate to, use the media or media channels, industry, blah, 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 social media, to construct and shape those narratives, I think is really interesting to think more about.
Can I jump in here? sorry, I'm just going to pick up on what Alan said. I think, there is something really interesting about what can be said and done differently without falling into a reversal of the gender stereotypes. So some of the stuff I've seen sometimes does that kind of those representations in a way that's sort of saying, oh, well, let's have the opposite. And actually what we want is a plurality of genders and versions and possibilities, but to focus our efforts on particular kinds of forms of patriarchal privilege. And I deliberately talked about in terms of perpetrators of patriarchal privilege, because perpetrators of patriarchal privilege aren't always women. And I think it is about, they aren't always men. They can also be women. They can be people of all genders. And I think it's really important that also the victims or the people who are on the survivors of patriarchal privilege, many men experience, the negative effects of patriarchal privilege. So if we could work, it's working to reframe things, to reframe these representations, to show the plurality of different ways of being. But also, I think there's a really interesting opportunity for MenEngage to enter into the space that was left by the old binary stereotyping in lots of ways, gender training space. I don't think gender training I don't know what's happened to gender training. There's a lot of talk now about women's leadership and some leadership training, women's empowerment, but I'm not sure there's any training associated with it. So I think there's something quite interesting about thinking, well, what are the kind of practices that change behaviours and reflection and reflexivities and accountabilities that MenEngage and partners could develop to take into organisations and to enable organisations to look at the exercise of patriarchal power in those organisations. And I think Alan and the comment made also in the chat about organised labour, again, movement to movement, solidarity-based networks also doing that critical re-examination of the extent to which the practices in those spaces sustain particular kinds of narratives around gender, but also into other spaces. I sit in the space of higher education at the moment. It's one of the most patriarchal spaces I've ever had to work in, and I've worked in quite a few. And it's the kind of thing, actually think, what kind of things could disrupt those spaces effectively? How do you link the stuff that might be said around, EDI, so equalities, the buzzword of equalities? How do you link stuff around masculinity into those trainings, hardwire them into what people need to kind of go through, and then think about how to change organisations from the inside out? Jyrke Edstrom and I did some really interesting work together with an NGO in London that was seeking to look, and were called in by the man who ran the NGO, saying, we want to be able to get to grips with the way in which we behave as an organisation and understand our own exercise of patriarchal power. Can you help us? And we had a very interesting time using lots of feminist consciousness raising and training methods to really try and get to grips with that. So I'd love to see more of that kind of work happening as well. It's quite practical, direct kind of work that could be done across the network to develop something that you can then take into other spaces.
Yeah, I'd like to come in here. Have you finished, Andrea?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with what most have said, and I want to thank Alan also for having brought in what we've been trying to do. And also, what I did like, and which I did mention, is that the report doesn't talk about just male and female. It also talks about the various positions that you may have in the gender fluid identities that you may have, the gender different identities. And I think we need to realize that this exists, and it's not that it's something that's come just for us, everything that we bring in new is said that, oh, that's come from the West, brought that in from the West. So that kind of, it's not true. It exists everywhere. This is something that does. It's important, I think, that I want to say that what you'll have said is the collective process and the collective powers is so important. And I think it's really, I love this panel we have here, the people who are also coming in. I'm meeting old friends on the chat box, etc. It's just that we've brought in you've managed to bring in a whole group, an assortment of people from all different types of positions where they work, but we have a commonality. I think that commonality is very important. That ideological commitment to want to work in saving this planet and the people who live on this planet. And the people who live on this planet, which Alan has mentioned also very clearly, it's not just this few who are making all the money and saying that, economically, like if you take Bangladesh, for example, economically we are developing, economically we are getting better, we are getting into the middle income group, but the economic disparity is also increasing tremendously. The women are facing much more insecurities, both physical insecurities, social insecurities, and psychological insecurities than ever before. So I have had young people speak about how, because they feel different from the biological body they were born with, how their parents have been so brutal, their own family, the family is supposed to be the center. So in answer to what is being said is, can we all work together? Yes, we can work together if we think similarly. But if we have our own boxes, which we are not allowing ourselves to even get out of, or even acknowledge that something else exists, then, it'll be some people taking over. When we're talking about MenEngage, we have to be, obviously people who come into MenEngage are men who are willing to listen and men who are willing to take part and understand what patriarchy is and feel it inside them to be able to want to change patriarchy. And a lot of women also, as you said, Andrea, a lot of women, patriarchy is not just men and women, it's a structure. It's a structure that exists, and wherever you may be following the same hierarchy and structure, which is very patriarchal in nature. And that is also the same structure that is in the neoliberal economy, the capitalist economy. And I think we need to talk about that very clearly. So yes, we need very much to come together, but we have to be very careful that we come together not at the cost of compromising the ideology, compromising our position regarding nature. Because when I talked about this in the hill tracks, this resort that is being built, it's really destroying thousands and thousands of years of forests, hills, everything. So you're going to create, when you hit out at nature, nature hits back at you in a different way. It has to, because it has to survive in a way. And I don't think we realize that how much we need to learn to nurture each other. And it's not just a woman's job. I think it's something that people think that caring and nurturing is only a woman's job. If men live on this planet, it is their responsibility too, to care and nurture. So how do we bring in people like you have done today and continue to start the discussion that has happened, the report that you all have brought out? How do we make it more available? Can we then start working? I was thinking that I'd like to start working chapter by chapter in Bangla, because most people in my country won't understand English. Simplify it and see how we can take it down to the rural communities. How can we then talk to people within cities who do, at least, even if they don't think the same way, they say they think the same way. I don't know if I can make myself clear. It's people who espouse the same ideology, but don't actually practice it. So can we start putting our fingers, pointing our fingers at them and saying that, this is how you should start behaving and this is what you should start doing? Can we start building the collective power together? That potential is there. And I think for MenEngage, it's very important. And I'm so glad you brought in the Fridays for Futures, because this is the future and we have to think about it. And we really want to start thinking about it. And I think it's really important to go beyond just Europe, America, or a certain English language, or people who have access to you were talking about the digital divide and access to this kind of information too much to every level. And at the digital divide basis, I'd like to say that one of the ways we've seen that it's the young boys who now have smartphones in Bangladesh again, and the smartphones are very common, and especially now with schools being done on through digitally. So classes being done. The boys are using this in a way to sexually harass women. So, and the women are the ones who feel that they don't have the knowledge to be able to protect themselves. So I think this digital divide should also take into consideration the sexuality that is being pushed forward, again with the same agenda in mind, and how we can work towards creating the change. So this change is required. What is this change we want is something I think we all in our minds are aware of what we want, but how do we go about it? How do we want it? That is something we need to be very clear about. Because when we talk about even climate change in a country like Bangladesh, the first thing that is told to everybody in the village and to all of us is 1/3 of Bangladesh is going to go underwater. And people who, because of economic displacement, because of projects, and if they live in the coastal areas or by the river banks, are said these are climate refugees. They're not climate refugees here at all. They're refugees only because you've pushed them out of that land, because you've taken over that land, because you've destroyed their land into tobacco cultivation or shrimp aquaculture for exporting to Europe and North America, so that they don't grow their own food anymore. So this displacement is happening. They're refugees not because of climate. Don't use that excuse. And it's really interesting that the government projects say one way of fighting the salinity coming in is go for shrimp aquaculture so we can export more. Disastrous. So I think it's time that we all start working together on understanding what it is, who's deciding, who's running, what are the questions we need to ask, and then get together. And I really want to thank MenEngage that if they can continue this kind of conversation at all the different levels, and we would really want to be able to get the linkages from the grassroots to people who are not just academics, but even to policy thinkers within our countries and globally. I think it's really important to keep pushing our voices, even if people are not listening. We just have to keep on raising our voices all the time, no matter where we are, how feeble it is. It's going to grow stronger because, it becomes a roar after a while. And be prepared, because it's not going to be so easy that if you raise your voice and you start making some impact, there's going to be people who don't like it and there's going to be backlash. So be prepared that we learn to, again, collectively learn how to counter that. And I just want to end there. Thank you. And thank you for having invited me.
Can I come in for a second? Okay, so there is so much to say and probably so little time to say it. First of all, I wanted to come back to a question that I think is fundamental at this point. I think Vidar made it before. So what is this new feminist, non-neoliberal, climate-conscious world? What is going to look like? What do we want it to look like? The point is we don't know, because we have never, personally, I have never been exposed to a systematic idea of a word different from what I know. So sometimes, like, you go into, you meet journalists, you meet people, and they tell you, you're a communist because you're against neoliberalism. I mean, I don't know what I'm for. I know what I'm against, because I know that this is causing a lot of damage and it's not sustainable. We can't go on like this. It's a matter of survival. So we don't know what there's going to be next, but we know that it has to be something different from this. And this is problematic, because when you try to change the mindset, sometimes as human beings, we need something to reassure each other, to know where we are going, and not just improvise. But the point is that we will probably have to improvise, because with these structures are not only like neoliberal, it's something that these kinds of hierarchies and domination structures have been in place for so long that both men and women, it's so hard to imagine something different, to envision something new. So probably the point is going to be, let's try to think alike and to think together and to discuss together what we want a new world, a new system to be like. But we have to be on the same page. We have to be convinced that this is something that must be done, and that we are on the same side, that we are both at the same time part of the patriarchal privilege, and some of us, of course, are survivors, but we have to solve it together. And in this context, the leadership must be in the global south, must be in those who suffer the most, who know what must change. I know that, for example, indigenous women have tried to protect forests and biodiversity for such a long time, and duty has been given to them, like it needed to be for them. But the point is that they could lead us, and we should be part of the change too. We can't even just say, okay, just work on it, just, you know how to do it. And I mean, it's the same thing all over again. We know that some parts of the population are increasingly disadvantaged, and in crisis moments such as the COVID crisis, you see those differences and those inequalities even more. Just imagine in Italy, among all the people who lost their job due to the COVID pandemic, 98% are women, 98, which is crazy. Mm. And yeah, and maybe the thing that we try to solve this by saying to men that they should do the caring job too, this is clearly not enough, as the paper said. And since we are in a moment of crisis, and we know that the climate crisis will increasingly exacerbate inequalities one more time, we know that from this, we have to start to think about the solutions to the climate crisis through the lenses of equality. And I think that starting from addressing patriarchy and masculinities is a good start.
Mm-hmm. I'm conscious of time as well, but there is so much to talk about, and I really am sorry to interrupt time and again. Vidar, if you have quick points to make before we start rounding off, and yeah, we'll jump in.
Okay, I'll try to make it really short. In the previous session, I think it was Joni who said that populists are gathering a lot of people because they have easy answers to big problems. They say it's the immigrants' fault, or it's someone else's fault, and that's easy. I think in some way we also have easy answers that we are all longing for loving, close relationships that are reciprocal, that are creative, that are not oppressive, and that we do care. As human beings, we do care for each other and for the planet. It's as simple as that. But it is to change the mindset. It's to change how we view human beings and men in particular, and masculinities. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we should get trapped in that we are so complicated. So we actually risk to be exclusive with all our different terms that are so complicated. We can find ways of doing it simple as well, but with love and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, to the point, the reason why we started and thought of this, organizing this series, is actually to start these conversations among those who are interested on the work with men and boys. So this is the beginning, and from MenEngage side, we will continue with these kind of conversations moving forward with our country networks in across 43 countries right now, but all of our members who are around the world in over 74 countries now. And for the coming 4 years, as Alan said, this is part of our new strategic plan. And what we wanted to kickstart with taking the opportunity of this global symposium that we are part of to start this conversation and sort of orient or give opportunity for our members to listen to different things that we need to understand, so that we can engage in a bit accountable way and in a meaningful way towards this common agenda of equality and justice, and becoming more sensitive towards the environment and people around us, so that we can start creating a momentum within MenEngage to not only think about, oh, I work in GVV, oh, I work on SRHR, but make it interlinkages between different areas of work that we are doing, or also we may not be doing, but may be interested to connect with. So I think the movement building approach is what really is driving what we are intending to do for the coming years now, starting with this, but also in terms of the solution. I think one of the things that we are really cautious about is not to go to, with the same lens of very colonial Eurocentric approach of how international development field has moved. So, what that means is that we can't continue with the way that the international development work and the Eurocentric, colonial approach to international development can apply in this work, because from the feminist movement, we have seen that it should be the other way. And that's what I think needs to be ensured, is this agenda needs to be owned by people in the ground where the lived realities are existing, and all of us are doing our own level of effort in terms of making and solving the problems that we are facing, and the solutions needs to also come from there. We can't just come out with another global solution and say that this is the solution, now you take, and this will solve your problem. I think that again is reinforcing the same colonial patriarchal model of saying, and the savior model saying, oh, this, we have the solution, go and take it. But I think it's more the other way around, so that we listen more, we hear each other, and join hand in hand with the different diverse solutions that we may come out with. I don't think there will be one solution or one answer to a particular question. There will be multiple solutions that resonate with each other, amplify each other in a way that meets to the crisis that we are talking right now, either looking at our own survival, which is at huge stake at the moment, but also the solution needs to come from the very bottom up model. With that, I think we do want to ensure that this resonates with the building ownership. I think one thing that we have learned from all of the work that you all have been doing is how do we generate ownership, and especially also reach out to men who are sitting in power positions, or people located in power positions, and continue working. And to your point, Andrea, we'd love to see how we can take this forward, because with this discussion paper, the idea is exactly what you have put out, is we take this all the way to the country level, so that members or partners or anyone who is interested to talk about this can come in and have engaged in a meaningful conversation, and not reinforce the same patriarchal paradigm. And we are also, I'll end with this, is we are not trying to reinforce men to come in the feminist movement and take over. It's about men joining in, taking our responsibility and fair share to challenge the patriarchal mindset, and listen and work under the leadership of feminist movement, and listen more, do more practical actions, rather than bringing men as experts for the things that we need to be learning about, rather than telling we are experts. And I in one of the previous conversations, Cynthia Inloy did talk about men tend to dominate because they are so fearful of them not being counted and not being absorbed as patriarchy envisions them to be in the picture. And that's the thing that we need to change starting now. And we commit to continuing that dialogue and conversation and process that it entails to make that happen. And we need all of your support, and we will like to be in touch with you moving forward. And thank you all and everyone for being available for more than 2 hours, and also prep and really, really grateful for your time, your thoughts, your insights that will help us to move a step further on taking this agenda and make it more political and meaningful in the way you all have been envisioning, and join hands in solidarity.